Once 1,000 strong, the 3rd Maine was now a shadow of its former self. 2 years into the American Civil War, they had lost nearly 80% of their men, cut down by disease, injury, capture, and death. Now just 14 officers, only 197 soldiers. What remained of the regiment slogged through thick mud, the rain pouring down on them as they marched 14 miles into south-central Pennsylvania. At twilight, the rain tapered off, and they ended the march in a quiet town of 2,400 people, featuring a tavern, a shoemaker, and a bank. A town surrounded by low hills, open fields, and rocky ridges. Gettysburg. Captain Alfred Merrill and First Lieutenant Woodbury Hall were in command of what was left of Company D. Just 21 men. The remnants of Companies B, H, and I, units so battered that they no longer had any officers, were placed under their command. They heard the deep rumble of artillery fire like a distant thunderstorm in the late afternoon. The fighting had already begun. The 3rd Maine set up camp along the main Union line at Cemetery Ridge, driving stakes into the soft earth while the low buzz of insects hummed through the fields. The rain had stopped, replaced by a thick, oppressive humidity. Sitting near the orange glow of a cooking fire, 31-year-old Woodbury Hall opened his diary and scribbled a note, a weather report. The night had turned warm and sultry. Then he wrote in his clipped, detached manner, "I walking very warm, shells coming very near the whole way." Around him, his exhausted and anxious company settled in. Private Charles Snell sat reading his tattered pocket Bible. There was Private David Ring, who had lied about his age to enlist. Next to him was Private Jeremiah Wakefield. Sergeant Henry H. Shaw scribbled a letter, probably to his father. Names that by this time tomorrow would be written into history. Men who didn't like Woodbury, men who had protested against his promotion to lieutenant. At least his uncle William Higgins, his biggest rival and the source of most of his problems, was in a Washington, D.C. hospital, injured and recovering from a gunshot wound to the leg. As Woodbury reflected on his men and his company, he had no idea that in less than 24 hours, half the regiment would be gone, that their blood would be soaking in the dirt of a peach orchard less than a mile away. Hello and welcome back to Company D, a history podcast that tells the forgotten stories of soldiers who fought in the American Civil War. We're not telling the stories of generals or politicians. Those stories have already been told. We're looking into the lives of individual soldiers, the men who slogged through the mud, the men who marched through dust and snow, the men who fought on the battlefields. To bring these individual stories to light, we have chosen to spotlight the members of Company D of the 3rd Maine Volunteer Infantry Regiment, men mostly from Bath and other towns along mid-coast Maine, carpenters, fishermen, and farmers. Why focus on this one company and this one regiment? It's simple, really. My great-great-grandfather, Charles F. Snell, was 18 when he volunteered with Company D of the 3rd Maine. He was from Dedham, Massachusetts. When the war broke out, Charles was living with his older brother in Bath, and his diary from his time with Company D served as a starting point for this project, our inspiration. I'm your host, George F. Snell III. Yep, that means there were 3 of us. Today's episode is about the complicated character of Woodbury Hall. Woodbury was an officer in Company D, and by all accounts, the most unpopular and disliked man in the company. An officer his own men labeled obnoxious and incompetent. Yet Woodbury had ingratiated himself with his superiors. He had impressed them with his military bearing and his detached, methodical approach to soldiering. There's a bit of Eddie Haskell in Woodbury Hall. You might remember Eddie Haskell, the arrogant, duplicitous character from the cult TV show Leave It to Beaver. Eddie was known for being a sycophant, a suck-up to authority figures while being a conniving wise-ass to everyone else. Was that Woodbury Hall? Beaver Cleaver described Eddie best when in season 1 he tells Eddie, "I don't like you. No one likes you, Eddie, not even Wally, and he's your best friend." Okay, so not the best Leave It to Beaver impersonation, but Woodbury Hall had the same problem. Like Eddie, nobody liked him either. Not even his own uncle, his own flesh and blood, his mother's younger brother, William H. Higgins. In fact, Uncle William would become Woodbury's biggest nemesis, the largest thorn in his side. But it's possible Woodbury Hall was just misunderstood, a stoic, duty-focused officer who had a terrible bedside manner with his own men. But regardless of how popular he was, Woodbury would help lead Company D and the 3rd Maine through the most crucial battle of the American Civil War, Gettysburg. Chapter 1, Soldiers All.
'Twas just before the last fierce charge, 2 warriors drew their rein, with a hand clasp and a parting word, for they never might meet again.
The Confederates bombarded Fort Sumter in South Carolina on April 12, 1861, leaving the fort in shambles. Mortars burned down the barracks. Cannons battered the 5-foot-thick walls. The headline at the Bangor Daily Whig and Courier said it all. Fort Sumter surrendered. Preparations for the defense of Washington. The president calls for 75,000 men and convenes Congress. No one had died, but the American Civil War had begun. Like tens of thousands of others, Woodbury Hall answered Lincoln's call for volunteers to quash the rebellion. Woodbury was 27 years old, working as a ship's carpenter in Woolwich. He had a wife and 3 children, including a 2-month-old daughter. But swept up in the patriotic fever spreading like wildfires across the North, and convinced the war would be over within a few weeks, he enlisted. He joined the 3rd Maine Infantry Regiment, Company D. But Woodbury didn't join alone. He enlisted with 2 members of his family, his uncle William Higgins and his brother-in-law Stephen Dodge. William Higgins was Woodbury's mother's younger brother. They had grown up on a farm with 12 children in Phippsburg, Maine, a town just south of Bath. Uncle William was a middle-aged ship joiner, married with 3 children. Big hands, big voice, his uncle was known as a bit of a loudmouth. Uncle William was 43 years old, just 2 years shy of the Army's age limit of 45. He lied about his age anyway, shaving off 5 years and claiming to be 38. Uncle William was appointed 4th Sergeant of Company D. Stephen Dodge was Woodbury's wife's younger brother. Only 25 years old, Stephen worked as a school teacher in Woolwich. He was unmarried and living with his parents and younger siblings. Unlike Uncle William, Stephen was no boisterous carpenter. He was an idealist, a true believer in the Union cause. He was convinced the South had lost the moral high ground and would soon be crushed, and he wanted to help do it. He enlisted as a private. And Woodbury? He was commissioned as a corporal. There's a photograph of him taken years after he became 1st Lieutenant of Company D. He's lean and long-limbed, slumped nonchalantly in a chair, wearing a slouch hat with the number 3 pinned onto it. It's set at a rakish angle on his head. His eyes are very pale. Under his hat, his hair is curly. There's a smugness to his expression, cocky and self-assured. Study the photograph long enough, and you begin to realize why some people might have taken a dislike to Woodbury. He has that look. Imagine a young Gene Wilder playing Willy Wonka, and you'll get an idea. Lots of manic energy and mystery bubbling inside that calm exterior. The war had barely begun, and tragedy struck before Woodbury had even left home. 1 month after he enlisted, his younger brother Charles died. Charles was just 20 years old, living at home with his parents, helping on the farm. He was buried at Nequasset Cemetery in Woolwich. Woodbury wasn't the only Hall brother to answer the call to war. His younger brother, 25-year-old Thomas Hall, enlisted in the 28th Infantry Regiment as a private. His youngest brother, 17-year-old George Hall, was too young to enlist right away, but he eventually joined the 7th Company Unassigned Infantry Volunteers in 1864. The Hall, Dodge, and Higgins families watched their sons, brothers, and fathers march off to war. No doubt they worried, but they also believed the war would be over in a matter of weeks. Certainly no later than Christmas. They'd all be home soon. As Woodbury marched off with his uncle and brother-in-law, he had no idea what was coming. That in 6 months, his uncle would turn against him and become his fiercest rival in Company D, working to sabotage both his career and his reputation. And 6 months after that, Stephen Dodge would lie dead on a muddy battlefield. None of them was going to be home for Christmas. Chapter 2. Thank you, Uncle, for being just you. Think of all the great uncles in popular culture. There's Uncle Buck, the lazy, carefree bachelor with the heart of gold from the John Hughes movie. There's the weird, wacky, and strangely humorous Uncle Fester from the Addams Family. And, of course, the cranky but lovable Uncle Phil from The Fresh Prince. Uncle William Higgins was not one of those uncles. He's kind of like Uncle Stanley.
All right, you mess this up, I'll introduce you to Uncle Stanley. He'll open you up like a tin of beans.
Or like Uncle Scar from The Lion King. He might be family, but watch your back. Within months of joining Company D, Woodbury Hall was promoted to 2nd Sergeant. He leapfrogged over his uncle, who was 4th Sergeant. Uncle William was not pleased. But Woodbury was impressing his superior officers, particularly Major Charles A.L. Sampson and Captain Henry H. Watson. Sampson wrote a glowing recommendation to Maine Governor Israel Washburne, urging the governor to promote Woodbury to 2nd Lieutenant. Mr. Hall is a young man of unexceptionable character and habits, and would, I believe, make a valuable and efficient officer, Sampson wrote. Watson, in particular, admired Woodbury. Watson saw something in him, a natural leader, a man with poise on the battlefield. He wanted Woodbury to be part of the company's leadership team. By the winter of 1862, the war stalled into a stalemate. The Confederate Army hunkered down in Centerville, Virginia. The Union Army set up winter quarters across the Potomac in Arlington, Virginia, blocking the rebels from Washington, D.C. But for Company D, the war wasn't the focus, because inside the camp, a bitter leadership crisis was brewing. The company needed 2 lieutenants to serve under Captain William Watson, a 1st lieutenant and a 2nd lieutenant. The process turned ugly. Pettiness, backstabbing, tempers flared. There was lots of behind-the-scenes politicking from Washington to Maine. 4 men were in the running. 2nd Lieutenant Alfred S. Merrill, a near lock for one of the positions. Sergeant Woodbury Hall, young and rising fast. Sergeant William Higgins, demanding and ready to fight. Corporal Henry H. Shaw, a politically connected upstart with a very pushy father. Captain Watson was clear about where he stood. He wanted Merrill and Woodbury. He wrote several letters to his superiors pushing for his choices. But there was a campaign afoot to smear Woodbury's character. So much so that Watson felt the need to write Governor Washburne and defend his choice of Woodbury. He was a good soldier, fearless in battle, and he had an irreproachable moral character. Woodbury, he assured Washburn, was the right man for the job. Watson believed in Woodbury, but the soldiers of Company D did not. They were adamantly opposed to Woodbury's promotion. In fact, they organized against him. The men wrote their own letter to Governor Washburn, making their position clear. They despised Woodbury. They called him incompetent and obnoxious. They urged Washburn to ignore Watson's recommendation and appoint William Higgins to the post of first lieutenant. And Uncle William made no secret of his own ambitions. In a letter to his brother, Higgins bragged that he was already doing more work than any of the captains or lieutenants in the entire 3rd Maine Regiment. He claimed that Colonel Henry Staples, the regimental commander, had praised him as the best sergeant he had ever seen. Uncle William scoffed at the idea of his nephew being promoted over him. It came down to an election. Captain Watson's superiors ordered him to hold a vote. The men of Company D would decide on who would lead them. They gathered around a campfire, 51 active duty soldiers, and cast their ballots. The result wasn't even close. Higgins won in a landslide. Merrill finished a distant second. Woodbury barely got a handful of votes, probably his own and Watson's. More than likely his brother-in-law, Stephen Dodge, voted for him, but that was it. The men of Company D had spoken. They wanted Higgins, and they rejected Woodbury Hall. The results were sent up the chain of command, and then they waited for Governor Washburn's decision. After a few days, the promotions were announced. First Lieutenant, Alfred S. Merrill. Second Lieutenant, Woodbury Hall. The governor had decided to ignore the election. Instead, he accepted Captain Watson's judgment and gave him the 2 lieutenants he wanted from the start. The decision stunned Company D. The soldiers were furious about the results, and they let Washburn know it. They felt like they had been ignored, treated as badly as the Southern slaves they were trying to free. It was unfair, an unjust result, but it didn't matter. Alfred Merrill was named 1st Lieutenant and Woodbury Hall 2nd Lieutenant. As for Uncle William, he must have been outraged. His promotion ripped from his hands and given to his nephew, a nephew he couldn't stand. Chapter 3. The School Teacher. At the time of his enlistment, Woodbury Hall's brother-in-law, Stephen Dodge, stood 5 feet 8.5 inches tall. He had a pale complexion, hazel eyes, and brown hair. At just 25 years old, he had already worked as a farmer, a bricklayer, and a school teacher. When he enlisted alongside Woodbury Hall and William Higgins, he was still living at home with his parents. Stephen was a true believer. Union victory inspired him. Defeat cut him to the bone. He believed in Lincoln. He believed the war would reunite the country. In the winter of 1862, Stephen wrote an impassioned letter to his father outlining his convictions. He spoke of hope, glory, personal sacrifice. The war, he said, had given him clarity. This war, Stephen declared, is for our survival. He dreamed of triumphant victory, of the Confederacy crumbling. I can feel it in my bones, he wrote. This war is nearing its end. He believed that until September 1st, 1862, until Chantilly. The Union Army was battered and bleeding, having just been crushed again at the Second Battle of Bull Run. Federal forces were retreating towards Washington, D.C., but the Confederates wanted to deliver a death blow. The rebels struck at the Union flank, trying to cut off retreat. But thanks to some timely intelligence, the Union was able to hit first at Chantilly. But the Union assault faltered. The 3rd Maine was part of a rear guard push to bolster the front line. It had rained all day. Now, as the afternoon dwindled, a violent thunderstorm erupted. The battlefield turned into a mud puddle. Men slipped and fell. Gunpowder turned into paste, making it nearly useless. The 3rd Maine holed up behind a broken-down old fence. It was so dark, Captain Watson wrote later, that we could not distinguish the enemy except by the flash of their guns. They ran out of ammunition and fixed bayonets. Lightning flashed overhead, casting eerie white flickers over the chaos. In the dark and rain, soldiers struggled to know if the enemy was still there. The men gave 3 cheers, screaming into the storm to let the rebels know that they were still there. On that dark field, in the wind and rain, Stephen Dodge was killed by a rebel bullet. The schoolteacher who believed that victory was in reach now lay lifeless in the mud of Chantilly. One of the few men in Company D that Woodbury Hall could trust was now gone. Chapter 4. Pitzer Woods. Let's return now to Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, the morning of July 2nd, 1863. Pitzer Woods was located just west of Seminary Ridge, where the bulk of the Union Army was stretched out in a long battle line. It was a dense woodland off of Emmitsburg Road. The terrain was rolling with shallow depressions and low ridges. The trees were mostly second-growth oak and chestnut. In the underbrush were thickets of dogwood and spicebush. It wasn't the woods itself that was dangerous, but what was hidden inside of it. Company D, now with the combined units of Companies B, H, and I, were being led by Captain Merrill and Lieutenant Woodbury Hall. The 3rd Maine had new orders. They were being detached from the brigade and assigned to cover one of the deadliest companies in the Union Army, the 1st U.S. Sharpshooters. The Sharpshooters, under the command of Colonel Hiram Berdan, was ordered into Pitzer's Woods on a reconnaissance mission to assess the Confederate line. The 1st U.S. Sharpshooters were an elite force in the Union Army. Every soldier was a marksman. To qualify for the regiment, a recruit had to fire 10 shots into a 10-inch paper target from 200 yards, and every shot had to be clustered within 5 inches of each other. Many of the men carried their own custom-made long-range rifles. At 1:45, as the temperature soared to 80 degrees, the sharpshooters crossed Emmitsburg Road. A young boy waved them down and warned them that the forest was crawling with rebels. The sharpshooters scoffed at the notion. The woods were too quiet to conceal that many enemy combatants. They dismissed the boy's story as the wild imaginings of a child. They plunged into Pitzer Woods with the 3rd Maine following. The trees provided relief from the heat. They ran directly into 3 Alabama regiments, the 8th, 10th, and 11th, well positioned among the trees. Colonel Berdan ordered his men to charge, firing, with the 3rd Maine moving forward to fight side by side with the sharpshooters. The air filled with bullets, slamming into tree trunks, snapping through oak leaves, and whacking into the ground. The fighting became furious, the sound of gunfire deafening in the dense woods. But it wasn't just the Alabama regiments in the woods. It was an entire brigade, thousands of rebels. It turned out that the Confederates were using Pitzer Woods as a staging area for an attack on the Union left flank at Round Top on Seminary Ridge. And the sharpshooters and the 3rd Maine charged right into them with fewer than 300 men. Sergeant Hannibal Johnson of Company B, now fighting with Company D, couldn't believe the number of Confederates in the woods. The odds were 1,000 to 1, he recalled. Taken by surprise, the Confederates regrouped and attempted to encircle the sharpshooters and the 3rd Maine to cut off their escape route back to the Union line. Colonel Berdan ordered a retreat, and the Union bugles shrieked over the gunfire, signaling the men to fall back. As Johnson fought his way back, Private Nathan Call took a bullet to the hip. Crying out, he fell. Johnson and Corporal John Jones grabbed Call, sitting him across a rifle, and with Call's arms wrapped around their shoulders, they tried to rush the wounded man off the battlefield. As they ran, Jones was shot in the back of the head, and all 3 sprawled to the ground. They were surrounded by Confederates. The rebels left behind the dead Jones and wounded Call and took Johnson prisoner. The fight in Pitzer Woods lasted a furious 25 minutes. The 3rd Maine lost 48 men killed, wounded, and captured, the majority, like Sergeant Johnson, taken prisoner. But the fight delayed the Confederate attack on July 2nd by nearly 45 minutes. Woodbury Hall later wrote in his diary, in his detached, stoic voice, "Had severe stand at Gettysburg. Sharpshooters well posted. A great many killed and wounded." Confederate General James Longstreet claimed that the skirmish in Pitzer Woods caused the Union to reposition its troops, preventing the Confederates from mounting a successful attack, which he believed led to the Confederate defeat at Gettysburg. Union General Daniel Sickles concurred. He suggested that the sharpshooters and the 3rd Maine, which he referred to as Colonel Berdan's dauntless little band, interfered with the rebel forces and provided much-needed intelligence on Confederate troop positions. If they are correct, Pitzer Woods represents a turning point, an often overlooked disruption that may have altered the course of the Battle of Gettysburg, brought about by an elite company of sharpshooters and a weathered regiment of battle-hardened Mainers. Because Gettysburg itself, a huge Union victory, changed the outcome of the war.
What a beautiful dream.
Say, girlie, let's make the dream real, huh?
Sure, I done it all. Let's be a case of hello, peaches and cream.
But the day wasn't over yet for the 3rd Maine. Later that afternoon, Major General Daniel Sickles, the commander of the 3rd Corps, made a controversial decision. He ordered the 3rd Maine and 3 other regiments to move off the Union line. Their new position was a peach orchard set on a bluff in front of Seminary Ridge. Sickles wanted the higher ground, but the maneuver created a major problem. It weakened the Union's main defensive line and created a deadly salient, a bump in the line that could be attacked from multiple directions at once. This put the 3rd Maine and the other regiments in an extremely vulnerable position. At the time, Sickles' decision was considered reckless. Some historians still think so, but others argue that this too changed the course of the battle, because it didn't just surprise Union leadership, it shocked the Confederates too. They planned to set up artillery in the orchard, and they weren't expecting Union troops to be holding it. Just like the delay the sharpshooters and the 3rd Maine cost the rebels in the woods, the troops in the peach orchard altered the rebel attack plan. Unable to take the orchard, they bombed it instead. The 3rd Maine hunkered down. One New Jersey battery fired 1,342 shots, a record for the Civil War, in the responding fire. Now the 3rd Maine was down to 162 men. They stood nearly alone on the southwest side of the orchard. That's when the rebels attacked with an infantry charge. An entire brigade from South Carolina slammed into the front of the 3rd Maine. At the same time, Mississippi regiments struck from the rear and right flank. The Confederates were overwhelming them. The 3rd Maine had to pivot fast, turning to face Emmitsburg Road, trying to stop the enemy from breaking through. All around Woodbury Hall, men from Company D were falling. A bullet tore through the left thigh of Sergeant Ebenezer Allen. Sergeant Henry Shaw collapsed. Corporal George Farnham clutched his foot, blood pouring between his fingers, screaming in pain. Woodbury glanced to the right and watched in horror as the entire color guard of Company K was cut down, including 26-year-old Captain John Keene, a shoemaker from Leeds, Maine. As the 3rd Maine collapsed under the Confederate assault, they fell back from the orchard. They regrouped. They fixed bayonets and, with the help of reinforcements, charged back into the orchard. And for one brutal hour, under relentless musket fire, they held their ground. But the Confederates came again. This time, they broke through. The 3rd Maine was forced to retreat for good. That night, Woodbury tallied Company D's losses in his diary. We lost about 4 men killed. He then went back, crossed out 4, wrote 5. Later, he crossed out 5 and wrote 6. Of the 162 men who had fought in Pitzer Woods and the Peach Orchard for the 3rd Maine, only 97 were left standing at the end of the day, a 60% casualty rate from just one day of fighting. The 2nd New Hampshire, which had stood at the 3rd Maine's right flank in the Peach Orchard, suffered just as terribly. They had gone in with 353 men. By the end of the day, 47 dead, 136 wounded, and 36 missing. They had 24 officers when they entered the orchard, and just 3 by the end of the day. After Gettysburg, when the Reverend Joseph Sherfy returned to his peach orchard, the place was unrecognizable. His barn burned to cinders, his house riddled with thousands of bullet holes, dozens of corpses hastily buried in shallow graves, and 48 dead horses rotting in the summer heat. A 12-pound artillery shell was still lodged in the trunk of a cherry tree in front of his house. The next day, July 3rd, 1863, was the final day of Gettysburg. The battle was a huge victory for the Union and a turning point in the war. But for the 3rd Maine, the fight was over. They were assigned a supporting role away from the main battlefield. They heard the distant thunder of artillery and the crack of gunfire echoing in the Pennsylvania air. Woodbury Hall and his men stood listening. The Battle of Gettysburg raged on. But for them, the battle was already over.
Oh, what a beautiful dream.
Say, girlie, let's make the dream real, huh?
Sure, I done it lawless for your case of hello, peaches and cream.
Chapter 6. One Last Indignity. Over the next several months, Woodbury was shuffled from company to company, a result of the 3rd Maine's scarcity of officers. From September to December 1863, he was placed in charge of Company F, and then Company I. He remained with Company I through the spring of 1864. In May of 1864, the 3rd Maine fought savagely at the Battle of the Wilderness and the Battle of Spotsylvania. Spotsylvania is where they lost Captain Alfred S. Merrill. You can hear about Captain Merrill's ordeal in Episode 1. In the aftermath of Captain Merrill's disappearance, Woodbury took command of Company D as the acting captain. 2 years earlier, he had been rejected by the soldiers of Company D. They called him incompetent. They insulted him as obnoxious. Now he was their leader. One hopes he felt redemption, but unfortunately, that feeling would be very short-lived. June 1st, 1864, the first day of the Battle of Cold Harbor. Captain John Moore, commander of Company C of the 3rd Maine, accused Woodbury Hall of abandoning his picket line post. He was charged with desertion. Moore, a 32-year-old sash maker from Gardner, Maine, filed court-martial orders on the back of an envelope. Then he had Woodbury arrested. After 3 long years of fighting, Woodbury must have been incensed. Arrested by an officer of his own regiment. What a slap in the face. Was Woodbury guilty? Or was this some kind of petty vendetta? We don't know. But Moore did have ties to Woodbury's old nemesis, his Uncle William. Either way, nothing came of the charges. The case was dismissed. Still, it must have stung. On June 28, 1864, Woodbury Hall was honorably discharged. The war was over for him. For the most disliked officer in Company D, this was how it ended, with a failed court-martial hanging over his head. Chapter 7, Second Thoughts. After the war, Woodbury left Woolwich. Maybe he couldn't stand the thought of living so close to his Uncle William. Maybe he just wanted a fresh start. Whatever the reason, he packed up his family and moved 50 miles north to Vienna, Maine, a quiet rural farming village. He left carpentry behind and became a farmer, just like his dad and his grandfather before him. He bought 122 acres nestled along a creek near Parker Pond. He grew potatoes, corn, oats, and barley. He raised milk cows, oxen, and sheep. It wasn't a grand or prosperous life, but it was quiet and steady. He and his wife Mary expanded their family. They had 3 more children, Fred, Isabel, and Thomas, joining their older kids, Marietta, Edgar, and Lizzie. As he aged, Woodbury suffered from asthma and heart disease. He blamed the war for his conditions. At 56 years old, he applied for a veteran's disability pension from the U.S. government. He spent the final years of his life on his farm, slowing down and watching his family grow. His uncle, William Higgins, died at the age of 83 on June 1st, 1900. One wonders if Woodbury bothered to make the 50-mile trek to Phippsburg to attend his uncle's funeral. Then, on February 6, 1903, at the age of 70, Woodbury Hall passed away from heart disease. In the TV show Leave It to Beaver, Beaver and Eddie Haskell never became friends. But in later episodes, they do become closer. And at times, Beaver shows a begrudging respect for Eddie. Maybe Eddie Haskell wasn't all bad. The summer after Woodbury's death, the surviving members of the 3rd Maine Infantry, including men from Company D, held a reunion. The old soldiers gathered to celebrate. During dinner, they raised a glass in Woodbury's memory. They saluted him and held a moment of silence. Maybe the men of Company D never liked Woodbury Hall, but at the end, maybe they came to appreciate a man they never quite understood. Thank you for listening. We hope you enjoyed the second episode of Company D and invite you to join us for the next one. Please subscribe to Company D on your favorite streaming platform. Our website has more information about the podcast and Lieutenant Woodbury Hall, including a photograph of him. Thanks for listening. I'm your host, George F. Snell III. See you next time. And remember, if you take the war out of Civil War, you're just being civil.
Company D is a product of Dark Party Productions, all rights reserved. Unauthorized retention, duplication, distribution, or modification of copyrighted materials is strictly prohibited by law. Company D is written, hosted, and produced by George F. Snell III. Our editor and co-producer is Jay Brewer. The Company D theme music was written and composed by Jay Brewer. Sound effects and additional music were provided under Creative Commons License 0 by Freesound, Sound Bible, and the Library of Congress. We'd also like to thank Richard Moore for his Civil War battle sounds on Freesound. The views expressed in this podcast are those of the hosts and guests and do not necessarily reflect the opinions of any organization. This podcast is for entertainment purposes only and does not constitute professional advice. The content is provided as is with no guarantees of accuracy, completeness, or timeliness.